In her initial introduction, Spider-Gwen swung into the comic book scene with a neon aesthetic and punk rock attitude that persisted through her first few issues. But as the series went on, a generally vague sense of dread and anxiety became more and more apparent within Gwen's world. Personally, I believe the series' transition to a more dark and gritty world of storytelling came with the Spider-Gwen story arc, Weapon of Choice. The arc established a number of themes and circumstances that wound up leading to a domino chain of drama and tension that shook the series to its core. But beyond the arc's contribution to the series' lore, I think it also deserves analysis for its thematic and philosophical developments. In Weapon of Choice, we find Gwen Stacy going through a crisis, an existential crisis. To discuss the deeper meaning behind this Spider-Gwen story arc, it helps to give a brief recap on what's happened so far. The Weapon of Choice story arc takes place immediately after the events of Spider-Woman, and its plot is based entirely on its aftermath. In Spider-Woman, Gwen finds out that her radioactive spider powers were in fact orchestrated by the Cindy Moon of her world, and after getting in the way of Cindy Moon's plans for world domination, she is forcibly given an antidote that relieves Gwen of her powers. Nevertheless, Gwen and her team of friends still manage to defeat Cindy Moon, and in doing so, Gwen receives a device that can help her emulate her powers, along with a few isotopes needed to power it. From here, Weapon of Choice focuses on Gwen Stacy's struggle to come to terms with the idea that her second life as Spider-Woman may be more fleeting than she had originally thought. Gwen demonstrates signs of depression and becomes reclusive, all while being unknowingly monitored and pursued by Frank Castle, the violent NYPD officer determined to arrest Gwen for her alleged murder of Peter Parker as Spider-Woman. This leads to Castle calling in Kraven the Hunter, a destructive confrontation between Gwen and Castle himself, and the ultimate incarceration of Gwen's father in an attempt to make up for having illegally helped Spider-Woman despite his orders to arrest her as captain of the NYPD. The personal turmoil that Gwen experiences surrounding the idea that her life as Spider-Woman does not matter and her deeds have no value falls in line with the philosophy of existentialism. The doctrine of existentialism, according to French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, asserts that in the duality between existence, the state of physical being, and essence, the state of having a specific and specialized purpose, a person's existence precedes their essence. That is to say, whereas a book, for example, is essential in that it is formulaically brought into existence with a particular purpose in mind, typically to share knowledge or to tell a story, people, on the other hand, are existential in that they are brought into existence without any real role to fulfill. For Sartre, the most obvious piece of evidence for our existential state was the fact that we have free will, the power to choose any option given to us. In this story arc, Gwen has become very aware of the existential condition of her life as Spider-Woman. She wasn't given her powers to complete a particular task like her peer Captain America, but was instead simply given to them by chance so that Cindy Moon could analyze the effects of the spider bite. The knowledge of her superhero circumstances leaves Gwen in a state of depressing unrest that Jean-Paul Sartre addresses in his essay, Existentialism is a Humanism. In his essay, Sartre elaborates on the philosophy of existentialism by presenting the consequences and responsibilities that come with existential being. For example, Sartre asserts several tenets of mankind under existential thought. The first being that man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself, which he refers to as subjectivity, as it highlights the freedom that every individual has to themselves. Mankind is only what they do, and nothing else. Sartre elaborates on this principle by emphasizing that it underlines the idea of responsibility, as it claims that every person is in control of themselves, and any consequences to their actions are their responsibility. However, rather than assert that people may do as they please with their freedom, Sartre pushes for the idea that people still need to act responsibly, because through every action that we take, we imply that all others should follow our example. As Sartre puts it, I am creating a certain image of man as I would have him be. In fashioning myself, I fashion man. To apply the principle to Gwen's situation, Sartre would say that as one of the few superpowered beings in a universe with almost no superheroes, every step and act that Gwen takes defines the role and idea of what it is to be a superhero in her world. Gwen even mentions this idea in her first appearance when she says, "When I put on this mask, I only did it because it freed me from responsibility. I thought I was special. And Peter Parker died because he tried to follow my example. I have to take responsibility for that. This mask is my badge now. If I don't define what it means, monsters like this will." As a result, Gwen begins to get a better sense of the heavy weight that her role as Spider-Woman has in her world, and is left to question whether she should even continue being a hero, since she experiences such a selfish pleasure from having the power. This sentiment of dread and guilt that Gwen feels in her current condition is what Sartre describes as anguish and abandonment. Her anguish comes from the weight of responsibility as being a role model and a leader, while her abandonment comes from the absence of guidance and direction she has to help her make the best decisions. For Gwen, there isn't some sign or some handbook to tell her whether she should continue to be Spider-Woman. And yet, any mistake she makes weighs on her greatly, since she must take responsibility for every act that she takes. Sartre combines these ideas and claims, "We are left alone, without excuse. That is what I mean when I say that man is condemned to be free. Condemned because he did not create himself, yet is nevertheless at liberty. And from the moment that he is thrown into this world, he is responsible for everything he does." But despite the existential dread that Gwen endures, she climbs through the story arc determined and reinvigorated. She accepts that there isn't some guide to tell her how to be a superhero, and she understands that she is responsible for every action that she takes. By the end of Weapon of Choice, she comes to terms with the burden of being existential, and nevertheless continues to act as a hero by following on her own morals, by acting authentically. Sartre likens the idea of behaving authentically to being a painter by suggesting that nobody would ever scold a painter for not following the rules of painting. There are no rules in art, just as there are no rules in life. All that matters is that the painter, or the individual, perform their actions because they genuinely think that they are good ones. For Sartre, behaving authentically is a key point in existentialism. However, Sartre's theories of existentialism go beyond Gwen's character development. A perceptive reader should compare Gwen's existential crisis with the antagonists she faces throughout this story arc: Frank Castle, Kraven the Hunter, and even the Bodega Bandit. For all three of these villains, the idea of existentialism and the responsibility that comes with it is lost on them. For example, in the Bodega Bandit's case, the tenet of responsibility simply isn't applied to him. He knows that what he does is wrong, but talks of how he is rarely ever held accountable for his actions. He goes so far as to say that Spider-Woman is really the only one who's ever cared to punish the bandit for his crimes. And we see that the Bodega Bandit almost speaks fondly of the accountability that Spider-Woman holds him to, speaking of how she almost does make him want to reform and change his ways. Kraven, on the other hand, escapes the idea of existentialism because of his desire to present himself more as a force of nature. In his previously mentioned essay, Sartre talks about how the idea of innate personality and instinctual nature are often used to dismiss existential arguments since they serve as a sort of essence that can come before a person's existence. However, Sartre deems human nature as being a fictitious concept, as he had already asserted that human free will removes the possibility of essentialism. Here, Kraven disregards the idea of whether what he does is right or wrong, because he just sees it as the natural order of things. Survival of the fittest, the strong must defeat the weak. This line of thinking refuses the idea of responsibility altogether. And lastly, Frank Castle avoids existential responsibility by claiming to act under determined passion. Similarly to Kraven's circumstance, Sartre addresses Castle's rejection of existentialism as deceiving himself. According to Sartre, any man who takes refuge behind the excuse of his passion, or by inventing some deterministic doctrine, is a self-deceiver. We see in Weapon of Choice that Frank Castle's character is described as an uncompromising force. He was a former military soldier, his family has abandoned him, and his job is really the only thing he has in his life now. Castle claims to operate under the merciless and unyielding authority of the law, which would imply that he has no free will and is only following orders. However, most all of Castle's actions in this story arc involve him straying far beyond the bounds of what is legislatively considered legal, and these moments are where Sartre would claim that Castle deceives himself the most. But Gwen sees this from Castle and says, someone has to hold him accountable. As trite as it may sound, she better understands that with the power of free will comes great responsibility.